Welcome everybody to the first of a six-part series on racism and society. My name is Stephen Pickard and I'll be the facilitator of this webinar. The initiative for this particular series is from Blue Star Intercultural Centre and its director, Dr. Mohammed Aksu. And the Australian Centre for Christianity and Culture is very pleased to be a partner in this and co-host it. The subject racism and society is always relevant, and in the current climate of increased public awareness, it is even more so. We are very familiar these days with Black Lives Matter movement and its flow on to Australia, confronting our society's racism, both explicit and implicit, and related discrimination. How we respond to difference in race, colour, creed is increasingly a litmus test of the kind of society we are and wish to be. The conversation tonight, Racism and Dialogue, is concerned especially to focus on the interreligious aspects of this and the value of dialogue in challenging racism and how dialogue initiatives could be more effective in standing against racism and discrimination. During the course of the next hour, you can ask questions on your YouTube live chat bar and they will come to me. It's my very great pleasure to introduce our three panelists tonight for this conversation. First, I'd like to welcome Professor Fethi Mansouri, who is the founding director of the Alfred Deakin Institute of Citizenship and Globalization. He is an Alfred Deakin professor with a research chair in migration and intercultural relations, and has held since 2013 the UNESCO chair in comparative research on cultural diversity and social justice. In 2016, he was elected a convener of the UNESCO Uni-Twin Network for Interreligious Dialogue and Intercultural Understanding. He is the editor of the Journal of Intercultural Studies and the founding editor-in-chief of the Journal of Citizenship and Global Studies. He has been serving as an expert advisor to the various UN agencies and regional bodies on cultural diversity, migration, and intercultural relations. He also sits on the advisory bodies of a number of state, federal, and intergovernment agencies. He's the author of over 20 scholarly books, including Building Bridges and Creating a Culture of Diversity, Migration, Citizenship, and Intercultural Relations. His book in 2004, Lives in Limbo, was shortlisted for the 2004 Human Rights Medals Award. So welcome, Professor Mansouri. Wonderful to have you on our webinar tonight.
Thank you very much for having me, Stephen.
I could also introduce our second member of the panel, Ms. Shifra Joseph, who was co-founder of the Ask Me Anything diversity program in Canberra, a great name. Started in July 2015, it's a program which hoped to challenge stereotypes, combat prejudice, and encourage mutual understanding by allowing the audience to literally ask anything. Shifra started working in diversity programs and community events as a classroom facilitator with the Jewish Christian Muslim Association, Building Bridges Schools program, and a former community radio host for Melbourne Jewish Radio. Shifra enjoys running, reading, and Shabbat. Welcome, Shifra. It's wonderful to have you on this panel.
Thank you.
And our final member of the panel, and here I want to give an apology, was supposed to be the Reverend Karen Kime, an Indigenous woman and a worker in Anglicare and an Anglican priest. Late this afternoon, Karen rang me. She's lost her voice, which made it rather difficult to be on a panel of conversationists. And so at the last minute, the Reverend Dr. Andrew Cameron has stepped in. Andrew is the director of St. Mark's National Theological Centre and an associate professor in the School of Theology at Charles Sturt University. He teaches in the intersections between Christian theology and ethics, social ethics, political theory, and philosophy. Interested in the connections between our emotions and how we go about ethical evaluation. He served on various bodies considering Anglican responses to social issues, and his current memberships include the ANU's Human Research Ethics Committee. Andrew, welcome, and thank you for stepping in at the last moment.
Thanks, Stephen. Absolute pleasure.
Well, panel, what I propose to do is to kickstart this by asking some questions of each of you, and in the course of that, we'll enter into a fuller conversation. First question I'd like to address to Professor Mansouri. If you don't mind, I'll call you Fethi. Fethi, as someone whose research and expertise is centered on intercultural development, multiculturalism and diversity, what do you think about dialogue initiatives? Do you think they are an effective tool in getting people to know each other and combating prejudice?
Thank you very much, Stephen. I think I should start by thanking you and all the organizers for hosting this very important forum. Thinking about probably breaking down your question in terms of why dialogue is important for our societies and why dialogue is important in particular for multicultural societies. And we need to look at two things. There's a premise behind multiculturalism as a concept, as an ideology, even as a graphic fact of life. And that basic premise is that our multicultural societies are built upon diversity that different groups and different individuals within groups bring to this society. And in thinking about diversity, there is, of course, the erroneous kind of assumption that diversity in many cases means potentially conflict, that diversity could also lead to, in some cases, as we've seen arguments in Europe, could even lead to segregation, leads to antagonism, leads to all sorts of problems in society. And that is, of course, not the case. We know that multiculturalism is a process that has as an ultimate end to it social integration, but it's a process that respects diversity for individuals and for groups to whom individuals might like to be affiliated, with whom they might like to be affiliated. So I think we need to really distinguish our approach to diversity as a cornerstone of multicultural societies, and that multicultural societies are in many ways enshrined and built upon an acceptance that we respect diversity to the extent that it does not obviously contradict existing laws, but that diversity in our respect and support for it, both collectively and individually. This is very important to highlight the collective dimension of this argument, because liberalism assumes that everything happens at the individual level. But human rights declarations and international covenants, they do preserve an element of collective affiliation for the individual through that membership of a particular group. And so we anticipate that multiculturalism in general, through policies, through ideologies, through enabling strategies, would actually empower and enable groups and individuals to be able to transition towards social integration without necessarily having to abandon their authentic religious, spiritual, cultural, linguistic, etc., worldviews. So that's very important. Now, where dialogue comes into it? So dialogue comes in because we need to ensure that members, individuals, and groups forming part of the same society are able to come together and understand their respective perspectives on some of these critical issues that affect all of us, be they societal, political, environmental, cultural, dealing with crises, etc. So I think, but dialogue means many things to different people. And what I would like to emphasize at the beginning of this conversation are a couple of things. The first one is dialogue is not simply an assumption to attach to dialogue, if that's all we think dialogue is about, that bring people who are different in relation to ethnicity, culture, faith, whatever, socioeconomic strata, and then think that by virtue of bringing them together, you're engaging in dialogue, and therefore the dialogue will be positive. Dialogue has certain prerequisites. Even within psychology, started in the 50s as part of the intercultural contact hypothesis, dialogue had assumptions that needed to be met before it can be effective. And a critical part of those assumptions is creating the structural conditions for everyone to be able to engage in dialogue from a position of at least equality, if not equity. And I say that because without having equality enshrined in structural conditions for dialogue to take place, then you're not having an equal exchange of perspectives, of views, of positionings, if you like, in relation to some of these issues, which can be very, very polarizing in our society. And we have to admit that. And so the first thing to do is conditions, ensure that we have the structural conditions. The second element, in my view, that's extremely important for dialogue is that those who want to engage in this dialogue, and I think everyone needs to engage in dialogue, given the level of super diversity that our societies are exhibiting nowadays, that all of us need to be aware of the required tools for us individually to engage in dialogue. I mean, I like to use the analogy that you need your head, heart, and hand, the 3 H's I call them. You need your head because you need to think, and you need to think about the knowledge that you might have about someone, and the extent to which that knowledge has bias, the extent to which that knowledge is prejudicial, the extent to which that knowledge reflects only your system of thinking. Then you need your heart, which is the affect. You need to be able to open your heart and be able to exhibit a level of empathy towards the other, regardless of where they come from. And then a notion of the hand, really, I'm talking about behavior here. We need to get into action to behave in certain ways that will really reflect the way we feel and the way we think. And I think without those tools, people call them, cross-cultural competencies, or doesn't matter what you call them, but without those tools, which need to be really built upon through systems of education, through system of media practice, through system of ethical governance, all sorts of things. Without those tools and without having the conditions, structural conditions, then dialogue is not going to be successful. And that's actually what's been proven in research, that you can bring people together. And if you do not pay attention to those 2 elements that are required for our multicultural societies, and we've seen this many times. We've seen it, for instance, when we had conflicts in the Balkan region. You bring people to the table for discussion, and you have not really addressed some of the key structural conditions, then of course we know what the outcome is going to be. So that's how I look at diversity in multicultural societies and the role of dialogue in that. But we need to be very clear about the requisite conditions for dialogue to be effective.
Fethi, thank you so much for that. It reminded me of a comment that's been used in the churches about learning to disagree well. In another sense, learning to dialogue well requires us to be well enough to dialogue. And you're talking about equality expressed structurally so that we are in a condition so that we can dialogue. And too often we don't attend to that. So is a mismatch and a power imbalance as we go about the dialogue. So this is a very difficult thing to get right, of course, and we are resistant to restructuring the conditions in our society so that there's some balance of power and equality, I take it from what you say.
Absolutely. I think you put your finger on the key issues that need to be really taken into account when we think about dialogue. And I think we'll have more opportunity perhaps to pursue some of these specific issues. But history is full of examples. You don't even have to go to the last century. We can go 500 years back in history and look at some of the examples of dialogue which was very successful, but also examples of dialogues which, or at least attempts at dialogue which were not very successful and led to very adverse outcomes. And that's precisely because of the absence of the right structural conditions which will have in them equality, will have justice, will have a respect for basic human rights. And I think without those things, really, we are not going to be able to achieve, or at least to ensure that through dialogue, we achieve the desired outcomes.
Thank you, Fethi. Shifra, I'd like to move to you and continue this movement on dialogue. It seems to me that a lot of your work, ask me anything you like, and it's a dangerous kind of question. It's really inviting people to move out of their comfort zones and move into a more mutually reciprocal kind of dialogue. And so I'd like to ask you, in relation to the question, for example, of racism, do you think younger religious people see their faith as being disconnected from social issues like racism? And what do you think faith traditions can do to better connect them to some of these big ticket items that are happening in society now, like racism?
Before I answer the question, I wanted to acknowledge that the apartment that I'm in is on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung, and this spot that my apartment was built on was home to Indigenous grasslands. It's very close to the Maribyrnong River in Melbourne. So just around the corner, there was an ancient Indigenous village and a quarry site. And I wanted to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people, their elders past, present, and future. I think that young religious people like myself chop and change between how they feel about social issues and how their religion can progress or advocate social issues. Sometimes, for example, I feel that my religion really helps me to advocate for global warming or environmental issues. Like there's a story about a rabbi that said if a messenger comes along and says, oh, the Messiah's come, and you've got a sapling in your hand, the first thing you do is you plant the sapling and then you go and meet the Messiah. So sometimes my religion really helps me to engage with social issues and environmental issues. At other times, I feel like religion gets a bad rap, and I myself get angry at my own religion and all religions because I think to myself, is it the cause of conflict? But with research and with study and understanding, I think, no, not necessarily. We're not arguing about whether we're not arguing about spiritual things, we're arguing about land and resources and politics. The Ask Me Anything initiative brought together people from religious backgrounds, but also from different cultures and also with different perspectives. So we had someone who was a radical feminist, we had members of the LGBTIQ community, we had agnostic presenters, and we had atheist presenters as well. And the conversations that we had with school groups through Ask Me Anything showed that different groups of people had a lot of areas that we agreed on. And the environment was one of them. Hate issues on the internet was one of them. So a lot of the trolling and a lot of the racism that you see from anonymous trolls on the internet was another big topic in schools. Feminism, domestic violence were also social issues that we discussed a lot. And yes, asking us, a group of students, to sort of dare them to ask you anything is really putting all our presenters out of their comfort zone. But when we set the foundations really well at the beginning of every session, the types of questions that were raised, even though most of the questions were anonymous, were really excellent questions. No one was trying to be funny. No one was trying to sort of get a rise out of us. The students were just really on board and really asking some excellent questions in every session that we did.
Thank you, Shifra. I wonder if I could push you a little bit about, in those sessions, to what extent the issues of discrimination and being discriminated against and associated issues to do with racism have emerged, and how that has been discussed.
There were a lot of sessions where we talked about racism, and I can give you some examples. So Scott was our Indigenous presenter, and he talked about the different assumptions and the different names he got called in Australia. I won't repeat them here, but he also, when he was in Europe, got a very sort of different racial experience, because in Europe everyone thought he was Muslim and thought that he was Turkish. So it was interesting for him getting racist names in Australia, which were sort of accurate because he is Aboriginal, but then in other parts of the world getting racist names and having racist experiences where people were calling him the wrong racist term. So, so we explored that a little bit. I myself also get the wrong racist term quite a lot, which is interesting, and that's where Ask Me Anything came from, because I was so sick of people assuming things about who I was, where I came from, what I ate, what languages I speak, where I go on holiday, that we needed sort of a session and a safe space where people could ask me anything. Do you want me to talk about maybe solutions and what we talked about in schools in terms of how students could combat racism?
I think that would be very helpful. Just if you can give us a brief story about that.
Okay. We had a session talking about speaking up against racism online. So reporting it. If you see hate speech on Facebook, Instagram, anywhere else, always report it. And then in a private message, talk to the person who was the victim of that hate speech to see if they were okay. And we would do that in real life as well. You would stay with the victim, see if they were okay, because often the victim can go into shock, and you would report it to someone. There are lots of problems though with online hate speech, where I feel that there are a lot of platforms that don't take it very seriously. Reporting goes unnoticed when students or other people who are being harassed because of their identity online try and block the person that's harassing them. They can only block one account at a time. So of course the person that's writing these awful things about them can just get a new account and then continue harassing them. There are often groups of people harassing the one individual or the one business as well. And the groups of people are quite coordinated and really strategic about how they go about the racial or religious attacks. And I'm hoping, this is something that I'm focusing on, I'm hoping that social platforms and internet platforms will take this more seriously and do more about it.
Thank you very much, Shifra. Andrew, I'd like to turn to you. We've begun the conversation about dialogue and racism and examples. Somewhat provocatively, I want to put to you a question. Is race real?
Thanks, Stephen. I just want to say at the outset how kind of impoverished we are not to have Reverend Karen and her Indigenous perspective, and very much you're all very much the poorer for her absence. But thanks for the opportunity to join in. Look, one of the things that I'm not an expert at all on the science of this that I'm going to throw in, but one of the things that I find fascinating is that on the one hand, we are each such an amazing genetic milkshake that it turns out, I'm told, that you can't actually correlate anything much with anything, particularly not with skin color, So this is one of the, if I can say it like this, one of the, what I take to be the idiocies of a certain kind of take on race is there is at that level nothing to it. But at the same time, of course, what it names are these absolutely entrenched lenses through which we name and regard others and other groups of people. And of course, at that level, it's real in the sense that it names this unbelievably hard to budge human capacity to sort of frame the world through these, perceptions of other people's affinity groups and so on, So, in a sense, it is, it isn't, and it is. I mean, obviously, it is in the sense that the concept of race has created and is creating so many massive causes of distress and hardship in people's lives that we'd be fools to say that it's not a real subject of discussion. But I just think it's worth observing that right down at that fundamental level, human beings are human beings, and this is you know, the tragedy of it in a sense.
Thank you, Andrew. What do you, I mean, does affinity with our own kind, I mean, we kind of sometimes stick together in a very tribal way as human beings. Does that have any legitimate place in our thinking about others? Another easy question for you.
Yeah, this is an important one to kind of take a position on. I found myself really resonating with Fetty's you know, original point that some of the major international conventions on this do acknowledge that we have these you know, collective entities that we come into the world through. You know, I mean, and they create certain affections. You know, it's quite right and proper, really, for people to develop an affectionate regard for those who gave them life and for those who mediated the world to them. And we call this culture. You know, and we call these families, and we call these extended families. And so, I think it's absolutely correct to defend and uphold those really lovely affinities that people have with one another. And the tragedy of this is it never needed to translate into that mine is better than yours, because I can still look out of those affinity groups to yours and celebrate it, and be happy for you about what's good about your affinity group. And this is the as I was listening to Fetty's comment, I thought this is the kind of genius, really, the way he was talking about dialogue. You do not have to pretend away those affections, those connections through whom we kind of learnt the world, while at the same time discovering our way into, you know, your way of seeing things from your cultural background. I think that's a very kind of sensible way to both approach our difference and to celebrate our origins, as it were.
Thank you, Andrew. Fetty, there's a couple of questions coming in. There's one for you. Yeah, Fetty, what's the best way to approach equal and equitable dialogue? The existing dialogue is not, and there's resistance to change. There's a stubbornness to enter into this.
Yeah, I guess the question you ask now is in many ways related to the first question in terms of how we can live together with difference within multicultural societies, and there is resistance to dialogue. One of the, I mean, I'm sorry to be perhaps invoking some concepts from academia, but they're really very helpful for us to make sense of some of these difficulties. I mean, some of the criticism that we are all aware of in relation to multiculturalism, which has been declared utter failure in Europe and has been declared as leading to segregated lives in the UK and Germany and France and a lot of countries have actually been very vocal in thinking this kind of concept of multiculturalism has done more harm than good. The problem with that kind of thinking is it picks on the question, the premise of the question you ask, Stephen, which is this resistance to dialogue, this resistance to engage with this particular social agenda. But I'm very obviously critical and skeptical of this kind of thinking, because for a start, we know that in many societies, which this particular social project has been declared as a failure. As a matter of fact, there was no such a thing as a policy, let alone a deep ideological underpinning of the policy of multiculturalism. So the criticism was really criticism of certain diversity in those societies, which political leadership wanted to failures to deal with the developmental goals, failures in dealing with international affairs, failures in dealing with immigration policies, you name it, you know, many problems that people wanted to really look at diversity, migration, and intercultural relations as a scapegoat, so to speak, to try to justify the way they've handled or mishandled some of those issues. But what is perhaps more relevant in all of this is that we pick on where has multiculturalism perhaps fallen short. This is what I'm interested in, and this is why we do a lot of comparative research, trying to understand why, for instance, in a particular jurisdiction, we are able to get particular outcomes. And when I say outcomes here, I'm talking about attitudes towards different groups. I'm talking about openness to the other in terms of, your acceptance of particular symbols of different religions, your acceptance of particular types of migrants, the extent to which you have favorable views of people who are different from you, as Andrew was alluding to earlier. So all of these things, we do comparative research, both quantitatively and qualitatively, and even ethnographically in some cases, because we really want to understand what drives different outcomes in terms of these attitudinal orientations that people who belong to different countries with different sets of policies and contextual situations tend to exhibit. And one of the things that we find in relation to that is part of the challenge the multicultural agenda is facing is precisely because it has not been mainstreamed enough. So that resistance to dialogue, Stephen, that you're referring to, is in a way on the part of the majoritarians, people who think they're the mainstream, they're the majority. That is not for us. Multiculturalism and diversity, it's only for those people of color, of people who are not born here, people who worship a different kind of God, people who look exotic, people who look whatever, darker skin. So that's how so that kind of association of the diversity agenda, of multiculturalism, with those minoritized groups meant that the vast majority of people who belong to the privileged, if you like, majority, in most cases white majorities, think that they don't need to be part of that agenda. It's only for them. Yeah. So when you talk multicultural understanding, when you talk intercultural dialogue, when you talk interfaith, interreligious, what have you, for them, that's not, we don't have to be part of that. It's only for those people who need to learn new things to be able to integrate and actually, in many ways, assimilate to our ways of being, culturally speaking, socially speaking, politically speaking, etc. So I think that's where you get a lot of resistance to this notion that intercultural dialogue is important. And this is where ICD in Europe has actually come from. So this notion of intercultural dialogue in Europe, as it came through the white paper from the European Council in 2008, overcome segregation, to overcome people who are not integrating properly, we need to look at dialogue so that everyone can embrace dialogue. And so interculturalism started to be invoked as an alternative policy to multiculturalism because it requires this personal commitment to engage in dialogue, which people felt was lacking in multicultural agendas. So,
yeah. If dialogue is so difficult at times and there's so much resistance, you can start to understand why people move into protest. And I'm just wondering, Shifri, if you'd like to comment on that, and Andrew and Fethi perhaps after, is protest more effective? This is a question that's come through this conversation. Is protest more effective than dialogue for disadvantaged groups or the minority groups? Does history prove that it is, for example, LGBTQI and civil rights movements, that protest is the better way to go and forget dialogue?
I can only speak on behalf of myself here, and even though this is live and it's going to be on the internet forevermore, I reserve the right to change my mind in the future if research shows otherwise. I think that looking at what people in Australia know about Indigenous history and about Indigenous incarceration and deaths in custody, we don't know the names of Indigenous people who have died in custody. We don't know Thomas Hickey, we don't know David Dungai, we don't know Tanya Day, as well as we know the names of Black Americans who have died in police custody. I think that's a type of racism, and I think that shows that the riots and the protests that happened in America have been a lot stronger and a lot more effective than Indigenous protests in Australia. So yes, I think protest is the way to go, because Indigenous communities, as far as I've seen, have tried in a number of different ways to get what they want and to get a voice in the way Australia runs this modern nation, I think protest is the way to go.
Andrew, I wonder whether I could press you on this. Is protest in lieu of dialogue? I mean, how do you see it in Australia?
Look, I think just before I sort of commit to a view on that, I just want to kind of echo, and I say this extremely tentatively, but with Schiffer, it's easy to kind of get these things wrong. But I got to say I was quite surprised. I mean, the international outpouring of just grief and horror really at George Floyd. On the one hand, absolutely right and proper, absolutely right and proper, totally think, that reflects very well on all who had a deeply humane response to something utterly egregious. So without in any way seeking to negate that or put it down, it did surprise me a little that it was the George Floyd moment that caused that outrage in this country, because there are many, many examples of terrible deaths in custody in this country that didn't seem to elicit the same response. And I mean, that's complicated. I don't know if I'm expert enough to sort of get to the bottom of that. There's something there about how Australians are so tuned into American agendas that we don't know ourselves, and I think that's something that is worthy of reflection. What is it about our own history and our own culture that means that we've kind of been tutored in American issues, largely through their export product, the media that we consume, to mean that we seemingly, perhaps possibly, if measured by protest, aren't in touch with what's actually going on in our own nation. And so the value, in a sense, maybe to go on from there, the value of protest is to kind of signal when people have this kind of primal, visceral disgust when they've had absolutely enough. But a primal, visceral scream of rage is not sufficient actually to progress us. So I think the risk with protest is, of course, that it runs out, it stops. And have we actually converted it into public policy action? And so, I'm oddly a fan actually of much more subtle and probably boring participation in our community, which is, the way in which influence in this country is wide open to all of us is through the very boring, prosaic sort of set of public inquiries that our respective jurisdictions are always holding. And it's a very few of us who ever sort of check into that and use those avenues to affect how things are done in this country. And my experience of those has been that if one participates in good faith well upstream of the sort of decision-making moment, and you've got to have your wits about you to read the boring website and find which inquiries about what, but to actually speak into those domains can be surprisingly effective, because after all, our leaders are actually looking for something to work with. They need ideas on how to fix this. So protest doesn't, maybe if I can put it a bit crassly, isn't maybe efficient, because it doesn't really know how to engage with these kind of intricacies of public policy. So that's I feel like that's a boring, bureaucratic Canberra style of answer, but it's true. Like, it is actually true. There are avenues by which we can have traction in our community that we're probably not availing ourselves of, and protest might indicate a kind of an ignorance of that, just as I fear it indicates an ignorance of how this country is working at its best and its worst.
Thank you, Andrew. I'm reminded as you've been speaking of the book that was published a couple of years ago by one of my colleagues, Professor Clive Hamilton, on a history of protest in this country, which makes for very interesting reading. But Fetty, I wanted to come to you on this matter. Have you ever been sort of tempted to give up on this whole dialogue business and the theory of it and the engagement and say, no, I'll start to write about protest?
Well, my take on protest is perhaps again slightly different from both Schifrin's and Andrew's in the sense that I'm a strong believer in active citizenship in many ways. And my view is that protests and in general social movements, I mean, that's what protest is in many ways a collective voice for the ones who don't have a voice. And for me, it's a form of conveying and communicating a collective message. So I see it as a different form of dialogue, but it's a dialogue that comes out of a situation where people have been suffocated for so long in not having enough space to actually be able to engage productively in relation to matters that affect them very, very deeply and very intensely. And using protests is a way of wanting to signal to this society, to the international community, to international agencies, to governance structures, that the situation is a point where really we need to very much hopefully we can progress towards some form of remedy. So for me, it's not either or. I see global protests, be they in relation to the environment, be they in relation to lack of developmental justice, be they in relation to racism, anti-racism, or colonialism, or whatever you want to. For me, that is a form of articulating an agenda that affects not just one person. George Floyd is kind of the symbol of a deeper movement, and the Black Lives Matter movement has been around for many years, well before George Floyd. It's kind of the last straw that broke the camel's back. And we've seen this elsewhere. So you think of the Arab Spring, the person who self-immolated in Tunisia is the last straw that broke the camel's back. And the whole Arab Spring started, and very quickly got into Egypt and other places. So it's always that the protest is a symbolic act that communicates much deeper, much larger structural problems that people want to be able to talk about.
Thank you very much, Fethi. A very helpful interpretation here. Protest is a different form of dialogue for those without a voice and feel despairing of actually finding their voice. It's not an either or, but it's a form, and that's extremely helpful. There's some questions coming here. What is it about? Why is it that when regions and areas are under pressure economically or socially or politically, that racial hatred seems to be on the rise? Shifra, would you like to comment on that question? Why does racial hatred so generative of so much tension in times when economic hardship really bites or political tensions are really strong?
That's difficult. I think it boils down to people and sometimes leaders wanting to blame a particular group, and we look for who to blame, and we often look outside of our in-groups, and we look to the out-group, and we like to blame the migrants, or we like to scapegoat Jewish people, historically for the Black Plague or for other things. And it boils down to when you don't have enough, or there's economic uncertainty, that you start blaming groups of people that you are scared of, or you don't understand fully. And if dialogue could address that misunderstanding and that lack of mutual love or friendship, I suppose, then we wouldn't get to that point. And if people like Pauline Hanson or other political parties start to claim that migrants are flooding this country, or migrants are taking our jobs, and like recently with coronavirus, we saw a big rise in racism towards Asian looking Australians. We if we all knew and we had a really good friend who was Asian Australian or Chinese Australian, then we wouldn't have that sort of antagonism towards Chinese Australians. But there are facets of Australian society that maybe don't have exposure towards Chinese Australians or Asian Australians. And so when they think of coronavirus and they think, oh, it came from China, so therefore it's a Chinese bio weapon that is taking over the world, and it's because of the Chinese that this has happened. So ultimately, it's our tendency to blame another group that leads to this rise in racism when there are economic or other issues in our society.
Thank you, Shifra. I'm conscious, friends, that we've been going almost an hour, and there is a limit to how long people can be on webinars. My experience tells me. But to finish up, I'd like to give you all an opportunity to respond to the question about the importance of interreligious dialogue. For example, tonight we have Christian, Muslim, Jewish traditions represented in this panel. How might a good quality dialogue between the religious traditions contribute to combating issues to do with racism and discrimination in society? I'd be interested in your thoughts about that. Andrew, would you like to have a go, and then Feti, and I'll finish with Shifra.
Well, I was interested in Shifra's quick anecdote from her tradition, and one of the things that could at very least do is bring to the table all the respects in which our own religious tradition is addressing the matter. So one of the things that has been deeply existentially significant for me in my journey as a Christian is is a picture that occurs at the end of the Bible about all people from all nations, tribes, people, and languages joined together in worship of in that case, Jesus Christ. You know, it's this picture of people absolutely able to be at one in what they're doing, and at the same time, the distinctions between them aren't erased. You can still see sort of where they're from and what their background has been. And that had a very formative impact on me as a young man in my whole sort of way of seeing others, you know, that there was absolutely no license at the heart of my my Christian faith for any kind of racism. So that was very protective for me when I hear various pundits making claims that I could evaluate against that tradition and go, no, I'm not, I'll have no part of that, you know. So very least, just even to share those stories about what our scriptures and what our theological thinkers and, you know, the thinkers in our religious traditions have said about this could be very fascinating and revealing, I think.
Thank you, Andrew. Feti.
In interfaith and interreligious, obviously extremely important dimension of trying to reduce misunderstandings and potentially conflict. I'm tended also to try to clarify a little bit in some of the terminology we use, and we've been using for a long time, but they have different assumptions. So the interfaith, there's a notion that faith communities, basically the Abrahamic faith traditions, because the notion of faith is extremely important, and that those three relationships that could be described in different ways, from antagonistic, sometimes outright conflict, sometimes coexistence. So the history is really full of such examples, and I can talk from my own tradition. You go back, and from the very first migration of the Prophet from Mecca to Medina, one of the first things they did in Medina, because in Medina at that time, around the time the Prophet migrated to Medina, what they found in Medina was that Jewish tribes, pagan tribes, some people who, you know, belonged to different Christian denominations. And so what they needed to do is actually work on what they call the Dustur al-Medina, Constitution of Medina. And that document, the Constitution of Medina, through which the various tribes, both religious tribes, as in Jewish and others, and in particular, there were very prominent Jewish tribes in Medina, but also other Bedouins and tribes who lived there, who were pagans, did not believe in anything. But the first thing they did is to ensure that there is regulated social relations between the Muslims and the non-Muslims. So it's kind of citizenship rights, so that these are the expectations of you and these are your rights. And then you fast forward to the Ottoman Empire, who again in the middle centuries, they've developed the concept of the dhimmi, which is basically, if you're not Muslim, then this is the way we interact with you. There are certain things you do and protections. But then you also have the other examples of where there was conflict and there was oppression and there was other things that were taking place throughout history. And nowadays, the religious landscape is completely different in many ways, because as we all know, and you probably are aware of this, the largest group in many societies are the non-religion people who are not actually subscribing to any particular religious tradition. And we in Australia, it's up to 32% of the population now. So we're talking about inter-path, if you like, dialogue now. That is a dialogue that includes people who believe and people who do not believe in anything. Bring them into dialogue, because a lot of these issues concern all of them. And a lot of my colleagues who also do fantastic work around interfaith and interreligious dialogue globally through the network in UNESCO, what we all always come back to is that the same premise that need to underpin intercultural dialogue need also to underpin interfaith dialogue.
Yes. Namely
that we don't use interfaith dialogue to whitewash certain things. We don't use interfaith dialogue for a feel-good kind of thing, performative act, but we use interfaith dialogue to really try to understand that regardless of the way we pray, regardless of how we name our gods, regardless of what kind of particular pillars of our faith we observe, and by the way, all of these things are enshrined in the Human Rights Declaration, in the International Covenant of Political and Civil, etc. All of these things are there anyway, but interfaith dialogue and interfaith leaders, what they can do is show that underpinning all of that is a deep humanistic common shared value for all of us. It reminds me of what Desmond Tutu once said, which is we really have to work out how we can live together in peace. Otherwise, we'll all end up dying as fools, because we keep on fighting each other's really futile wars and conflicts. And so for me, interfaith dialogue needs to also be like that. It has a deep meaning of trying to really allow people to focus on that which really defines all of us as members of the human race. And human race is one race, by the way. There's not many races. We are all a human race. We all belong to the same race, which makes the whole concept of racism slightly kind of an oxymoron in many ways. But that's my take on it. Really, it needs to be more than just a talk fest. It needs to allow people to see the meaning making that they can achieve through spiritual reflections, through their own faith tradition, and focusing on those issues which define humans in general as members of the same large family, where we have differences, but those differences make us actually much more interesting, much more, if you like, stronger, able to be more creative in dealing with crises. Not that those differences drive us apart to the point where we think, as you were saying earlier in your previous question, the moment there is a crisis, we turn on one another, which is what the definition of fool is, in my view.
Thank you so much, Fethi. There's a lot of resonance there, and in my own experience, it's certainly the case that when people from different religious traditions and none at all look together to the issues that confront the whole of humanity, that is when they discover their common bonds together and they can work together well. But when they are fixated on their own particular patch, they never really address together the things that really challenge and call us to something higher. So Shifra, to put a slightly different angle on this for a final comment from you, I'm wondering, in the light of what Andrew and Fetty have been saying, whether you see the importance of, for young people particularly, but not only the young people, but your generation, creating safe places for these kind of conversations with people that ordinarily might not ever meet each other, that they kind of in their own patches, so to speak, whether it's religious or otherwise. How important do you think for young people, the dealing with some of the social issues like racism and discrimination and other things, that your work, it seems to me, Ask Any Question, is really a way of trying to create safe places for such dialogue to take place?
Yes, it's something that we've always tried to cultivate, and we have worked and aimed to cultivate a safe space in a school, in a classroom very quickly, because we only have maybe 2 hours with sometimes 25 students, sometimes up to 500 students. So we've got to very quickly set the foundations, create a safe space, and then move into dialogue or conversation mode. I do think, however, for dialogue in the classroom to work long term and to have a lasting effect on students, we need to do it across a year or across a term, so that we're working with the same students once a week or once a fortnight. And there was a program, Building Bridges, in Melbourne a few years ago that I was involved in, and that brought in Muslim school students and Jewish school students, and we worked with them for 2 hours every week across a few sessions. The problem, however, with any dialogue program is that I find that we're preaching to the converted, in a sense. Because I reckon the audience we have tonight, everyone listening today, and people who log on and watch this in future are going to be people who generally agree that dialogue and multiculturalism is positive. I don't know how many people from the far right or people who maybe hold anti-Semitic views or anti-Muslim views or anti-religious views will watch this. And that, I think, is the true challenge, creating a safe space, not just for people who generally hold the same views and values as I do, but creating the safe space for people who are very unlike all of us.
Thank you very much, Shifra. I think you put your a critical issue about the importance of safe places, and often it's the like-minded listening to each other, and the real challenge is to move out of our comfort zones, which is where we began a little bit in this webinar. I'd like to thank our guests tonight on this first of our 6-part series on racism and society. Professor Fetty Mansouri, Shifra Joseph, and the Reverend Dr. Andrew Cameron, representing 3 different faith traditions, and inviting us to think more carefully about some of these fundamental issues. One of the things that's come through in this very interesting engagement has been the significance of dialogue and its relationship to the voiceless and protest, moving out of our comfort zones, and the creation of safe places. There's many things that I've learned, and I hope those of you that have been able to log into this webinar will be able to think on these things and share them with your friends. So again, thank you to Blue Star Intercultural Centre and the centre that I represent, the Australian Centre for Christianity and Culture. Both of these centres, I might say, are really quite given over to the creation of hospitality and safe places. And we certainly need more of these kind of places. And I want to thank our guests for the way you have contributed to the growing nurturing of such safe places in this society. Thank you again. and we'll now close down the YouTube live feed. So thank you.
Thank you.